Hello and welcome to the Maxim Institute Book Club. My name is Judy, I'm the Communications Coordinator at Maxim and I'm your host today. I'm joined today by Maxim's Research Manager Kieran Madden and Communications Manager Jeremy Vargo. Hello and welcome to both of you.
Hello Judy.
Good morning, Judy.
Today we will be discussing our book for this month, Ross Douthat's 2020 The Decadent Society, How We Became Victims of Our Own Success. This book is Douthat's commentary, analysis, and critique on society's ideological exhaustion, social decay, and spiritual indifference. Within the Western world's context, Douthat discusses how decadence has infected, challenged, and formed much of how we live today, and how that has been decadently the same for the last 2 decades. On the podcast, Jeremy, Kieran, and I will give our own thoughts on the book, on decadence, and on how parts of what Douthat highlighted are seen in the New Zealand context. To begin with, for those who haven't read the book yet, Douthat outlines decadence by drawing on cultural historian Jacques Bazun's description, which I'll quote. All that is meant by decadence is falling off. It implies in those who live in such a time no loss of energy or talent or moral sense. On the contrary, it is a very active time, full of deep concern but restless, for it sees no clear lines of advance. The forms of art as of life seem exhausted. The stages of development have been run through. Institutions function painfully. Repetition and frustration are the intolerable result. Boredom and fatigue are great historical forces. And it will be asked, how does the historian know when decadence sets in? By the open confession of malaise. When people accept futility and the absurd as the normal, the culture is decadent. Ross goes on to say that generally there are 4 signs of decadence: economic stagnation, the decay of political institutions, intellectual exhaustion, and a very low birth rate, all of which must be experienced at a moment of material plenty. So, from that, Jeremy and Kieran, how do you understand what decadence is?
From what I can tell from Douthat's book, it's less about what we might expect decadence to look like as far as a huge feast and the sort of decadent Rome before the fall. He talks more about decadence being a falling off, or something that society has sort of reached its pinnacle and is now slowly decaying. It's boring. Society is sort of exhausted in the social, in the political, in the cultural. And he also talks about lowering birth rates and fertility as well.
I mean, I think decadence is the absence of newness. He puts a lot of stock into the idea that anti-decadence is forward movement, is kind of the discovery of new things. It's fresh. It's invention,
creativity, imagination.
Yeah, and I think also one of the big things he loves and points to as a sort of the reason why he sort of argues that we are decadent is that there's a lack of exploration. There's a lack of discovery. There's a lack of, I guess, for want of a better term, domination. He talks about the expansionist kind of colonization, movement of empire, that sort of growth. And I think the word growth is used a lot as, that basically without, the anti side of decadence is a growing, and that decadence is a stagnation, a lack of growth. It's all those sorts of words around stagnation where you're just sort of sitting in the same thing. One of the things that I thought while I was reading it is that for me, he doesn't quite I think that decadence is more personal than societal, and I think that the concept of a decadent society is kind of like society is just kind of an explosion of what is going on in the hearts and minds of the people living in the society, right? So the society is always just kind of a collection of, it's an aggregation of the sort of average of what's going on in most people's lives, or in the majority of people's lives. And so I think that the thought I had about decadence was that essentially it's pleasure without joy, comfort without joy. It's a cynical comfort. We're all quite happy with the status quo, but we're not that happy. So if you go, I don't want things to change too much unless they get better. But also I'm not really willing to risk the lot that I have now, because in risking it, everything might just get worse. And so there's a fear involved in decadence that I thought was a really interesting through line under it, that we want things to get better, but we're too afraid of movement.
He draws a few allusions to Huxley's Brave New World in the sense of and uses another quote of comfortably numb, and I think the comfortably numb description fits Douthat's idea of decadence. In A Brave New World, the character Savage talks about the reason that there isn't any innovations in art or society or poetry or culture there is because there is no suffering. In that society, it's just about distraction and pleasure, but without suffering, without joy, as you said, there's a sort of a black and white or a grey existence. It's not about reaching the human heights of love and flourishing. It's just dull, exhausting, kind of boring, and there's not a risk there. It's comfortable, and I think that comfortable is part of that stagnation, but it is a bit of a vicious cycle as well, without any sort of risk or without newness, creativity, imagination. We're basically stuck, is his argument.
The idea that life, and it's just so interesting that the idea of the pursuit of happiness, I mean, that's in the US Constitution, right? In a kind of liberal society where there's no, you can't sort of confidently say that we have a unifying kind of faith or a unifying moral backbone that all of us kind of agree to and we've signed up to. The only thing that we can kind of say, oh, that's probably a good thing, is essentially happiness. And what's interesting about happiness is that if your life is sort of consistently happy, or if you're just consistently sitting at the same level of kind of comfort or pleasure, the way that it seems that the human heart or the human soul works is that we actually, there's boredom that sets in. There's a malaise that sets in when everything is the same all the time. And it's that sort of, I got a lot of how he was talking about stagnation and decadence as kind of that sense of, depression for a person is not constantly feeling overwrought or despairing or sad necessarily. Depression a lot of the time is the absence of feeling. It's the sense that you're insulated from the rest of the world around you and you can't connect to what other people are doing or what other people are feeling. You feel disconnected.
That's a numbness.
Yeah, a numbness. And what's really interesting is that often there is this thing where we see that in order to feel the high highs, we also engage with the low lows. When we get that life includes suffering and that we embrace the idea that life is about joy and anguish, that it's not nice to go through suffering and it's not nice to have sadness or, bad things happen. But there is also a certain sense when you look at least in the history of Christianity that I've looked into, there is a real sense of liturgical Catholicism and Anglicanism and the sort of those longer term Christian traditions that the mourning and the rejoicing are hand in hand, mourn with those who mourn, rejoice with those who rejoice. That is a baked in part of that sort of faith tradition, and it recognizes something that's inherent about the human condition. And I think that if we try to remove all mourning, we try to remove all the hardship from our lives, we also remove kind of the ability to feel that kind of jump and a leap for joy. And that's what got me thinking around the whole decadence is basically pleasure or comfort without joy, without hope.
And I think Douthat quotes the poet Auden talking about that decadence is broadly characterized by a lack of creativity, warmth, and hope. And I think those, you sort of touched on that, Jeremy, about the lack of hope, which is sort of it's a current mindedness rather than a sort of future mindedness. To be hopeful, you need to be thinking about the future and looking into the future. One of the interesting aspects, and I may be diverging here, but let's do it. Douthat talks about some of the questions around fertility and replacement rates for a lot of countries, and makes the argument that as we broadly in the West, with a few exceptions, have fewer children, there's less of a sense of having a stake or investment into the future. And I found that a really interesting reflection on that. Pretty much every country in the West has a below replacement rate fertility, which is less than 2, with the interesting exception of Israel, which is above 3. And part of the reason for that is that Israel is sort of war-torn in some aspects. It's very difficult to be comfortable in Israel, but you also see in Israel there's a deep Jewish tradition and culture. What's interesting there is Israel is also a real seedbed of innovation in the West as well. So there's some sort of, I think, Douthat, if he is asked what is the least decadent Western nation, he'll revert to Israel, which is interesting.
I heard him say in an interview that he believed that Israel had the history that you were talking about, and then they also have a sense of mission to carry on their long story, and that kind of feeds into the higher birth rate. And it was just a really interesting reflection that he had, that they do have a mission to carry on their line is that something that we don't have and that we don't want to have? But then in one of his other reflections, he was saying that a lot of Western countries who do have a lower birth rate, they want to have more kids, but then they don't just because of financial things. He was talking about female empowerment and the fact of like the introduction of the pill and contraception.
I mean, I think that idea behind Israel and the sort of mission that you talk about really plays into the sort of broader idea that I had around narrative, that basically when you believe as an individual that you are a member of a society that is living within or living out a grand narrative, and this is what I think he's talking about when he's talking about, narratives of discovery or colonization, right? Of that essentially the British Empire, like if you were in England and you were kind of like, our country's doing this and we've got to work hard so that we can build the ships that take our explorers out there, or we've got to work hard so that, the dark underbelly of that is we've got to maintain the slaves that enable us to have all of that as well. And so, but the narrative was that, this is our destiny as a nation. In terms of Western civilization, we've gotten to a point where we have seen the end of that discovery and also the end of that narrative because we've seen too much of the dark underbelly of that. One thing that I feel frustrated about with the book is that the Auden quote that you brought up before is, what fascinates and terrifies us about the Roman Empire is not that it finally went smash, but rather that it managed to last for 4 centuries without creativity, warmth, or hope. Douthat really uses the Roman Empire's kind of whimper out as kind of a model for what he thinks a decadent society looks like and why it's kind of bad. But he never talks about the development of the Roman Empire. And the idea that the Roman Empire basically went around pillaging and destroying and subjugating, this huge amount of humanity that didn't want to be Roman. They didn't want to have their independence. They didn't want to come under Roman rule. And so there's this idea that, yes, we look at the Roman Empire like, oh, wow, huge, but there's a huge amount of destruction that comes with the creation, or, just so a few Romans can feel like they have a grand narrative to live out of and they're not decadent. I don't necessarily know whether that's a better way to live than the current sort of comfort.
At the end of the book, Douthat makes a series of scenarios such as transhumanism, other things of which I know as a conservative Catholic writer he is broadly morally against, and would call those anti-decadent movements. And so there's a sense that he would say, yes, these things may not be good, but they are not decadent. And so that's part of the way that he uses decadence, is in a sense of he tries to make it so it's not a normative good or bad thing, although he's sort of arguing that it is bad in a way. That's been part of my confusion as well. He really wants to, he's against decadence. And I think, I would say I am as well, but there's also a notion of the good in there somewhere, that you can't just take this idea of decadent or non-decadent. There needs to be a broader notion of the good and human flourishing underpinning what he's talking about.
One of the biggest examples he uses is space travel. I know that Jeremy has a bone to pick with this, but is that part of the idea of searching for something bigger and something that the whole world, the space race was based in the middle of the Cold War. That was something that people could focus on greater than just themselves. Do you think that some way we've lost that collective good or collective?
The whole space travel thing is quite funny to me. He's obviously someone who grew up with that, in that kind of flush of excitement about sort of man going into space and having the capability of being able to do that. I would argue that man going into space didn't really accomplish much other than, distracting people. And I think this is one of the things, is that you can have grand narratives that kind of discipline people's minds to feel like they have purpose, but ultimately if that thing that they're distracting themselves with doesn't end in something good, it's not actually moving towards something that is helpful or constructive, that ultimately people will see through it. I don't know if you've seen the last season of The Crown, But there's an episode in which Prince Philip, there's a malaise around, and this is kind of the theme of the whole season with Prince Philip, is that he's struggling with the fact that he's the male in Buckingham Palace, but he's not the king. He's limited in so many ways. He's the Queen's husband, and so he doesn't really get to do anything. And he has this fascination with man landing on the moon, and he's just like, this is the most incredible thing. These men who have landed on the moon, they've gone somewhere no man has gone before. Like, there's this whole, he constructs this importance in his head of how amazing it is, and he sort of derails the royal visit from the astronauts to try and get these men in a room alone with him so that he can kind of feed off of their purpose and imagination. And when he meets them finally, he basically meets 3 military men who have no imagination, who are completely disappointing to him because they don't have anything to offer. They've gone to the moon, but it's basically a mechanical triumph. It's a triumph of technology and engineering rather than a triumph of the will or of the soul. And what's interesting is that it actually points him back into this group of vicars and clergymen who've been kind of burnt out by the work of the church and have started meeting together to discuss kind of high-level theology and high-level kind of matters of the soul. And I found that so interesting. And in the same year, I watched Ad Astra, which is the movie with Brad Pitt. And I hated the movie Ad Astra because it promised a lot in terms of being a movie about exploration. But in the context of reading The Decadent Society, I thought it was really interesting to think back on. And apologies if you have not watched Ad Astra, there will be spoilers. But basically, Brad Pitt, at the beginning of the movie, his father, who left when he was about 9 or 11 years old to explore space. And there's been something that's gone wrong. Brad Pitt's now in his sort of 40s, and he gets co-opted into this mission to try to communicate with his father. He finally finds his father and finds out that basically they got to the edge of our solar system and got kind of incontrovertible proof that there is nothing outside of our solar system. There are no more people. There is no more life out there. His father was just determined that he would keep going because there had to be life out of the solar system. Even when he was told that there was nothing else out there, he still would not come back to Earth to form a relationship with his own son. The climax of the movie is Brad Pitt realizing, actually, let's stop looking out there. Let's look to our relationships. Let's look to what we already have on Earth. Let's look to, our familial relationships. Let's look towards making life here as good as possible. It's part of what I felt reading this, is that Douthat a lot of the time is talking about the antidote to a decadent society is to have a new distraction, almost to do more space travel, to discover something more technologically, or to have a war. Like, it's not like he wants a war, but he's like, at least a war would make us not decadent. It would give us a purpose. But my naive hope, and it is naive, I know, given where politics is at, but I do think that when we get to a point where we're no longer pushing out for distraction, that actually it's an opportunity for us to stop distracting ourselves from the issues that we actually need to deal with that are present in our societies, like racism, like, inequality, like you're making sure that every person knows what love is. And this idea that for people who hold an idea of what it means to be human, that actually, this decadent society we're confronted with is not necessarily a problem that we need to solve with some external thing, but it is actually an opportunity for us to go, we are comfortable. We don't have a huge amount of external problems that we need to go and fix, although there are external problems. But it's an opportunity to actually, and I see this in New Zealand culture, and I'd be interested to know what you think about sort of the New Zealand context, because he talks about America and Europe a lot. But I think that in New Zealand, we are already seeing a bit of this with the kind of Māori Renaissance and this push to recognising New Zealand's colonial history more fully, and actually talking about what it means to properly reconcile our history with Māori and land wars and all that. And that's an uncomfortable thing. And I think that the opposite of decadence is actually choosing to encounter discomfort. And choosing to put ourselves, and I think that what's interesting about growth is it always involves stretching, it always involves struggle, and I think that possibly instead of an external physical struggle, we could actually engage in an uncomfortable struggle to try to reconcile what it means for us to be different cultures living in the same place.
I just wanted to continue on from that. Coming back to the idea of warmth, you talked about us needing to some extent, embrace suffering and embrace growth and embrace discomfort. I was reflecting this morning about this idea of warmth, and that part of what I think Douthat's describing is a cold society. And I think if we think about one of the aspects that he speaks about is technological advances, and that one of the big, or perhaps the only significant technological advance has been digital, has been the internet, has been new ways of communicating, but also new ways of distracting ourselves and isolating ourselves from one another. And it just seems to me that the digital existence is a cold one. And so to reclaim part of what Auden is talking about, part of this warmth, it requires significant engagement with one another and with, I think the Prince Philip story was a really apposite one, because he's disheartened, he's disenchanted from what he was trying to get a sense of meaning and I guess a sense of anti-decadence as well, that he was surrounded by the more traditional sense of decadence in
literally living in a palace
in Buckingham Palace. But instead he found meaning and depth in being vulnerable with a group of men. And perhaps like you say, Jeremy, it's not the solution to decadence is not a new space race. There's potentially something a lot more simple, a lot more relational, a lot more engaging more deeply with one another.
And I'm surprised that Douthat, being a Catholic, didn't say that. Like, I wonder if he just doesn't have any hope that we could even get there. Even though he talks about the fact that, that America's previous iterations managed to avoid decadence, partly because he says that there were religious revivals, throughout several generations.
Yeah.
And it's just so interesting to me that he kind of doesn't really expect that. In nothing he writes, he doesn't expect us to have a revival of.
Well, he paints a sort of religious revival as one of the scenarios that could sort of break the deadlock of decadence. But I think he sees the culture of the church, of American institutions, as, I think, what's he say, sclerotic. But basically like the hardening of a wound. It's hardened, it's like a scar, you can't do anything about it. So I think he paints it as a scenario, but Rod Douthat talks about the Benedict option, and that there perhaps has pockets of renewal and different ways of, anti-decadent ways of living. But I think he sees a possibility of a broader sort of cultural renaissance as very unlikely. And I think I would share that sense.
And the whole book just feels like it's a doom and gloom. Like there's no hope for any of us getting out of decadence. Political ideologies have gone, and like the religious stagnation is just, there's nowhere to move from here. It just feels hopeless. That's how I ended the book.
It's a great way to leave it. It's interesting because he does, part of the sort of innovations of this book is a lot of commentators on the right are very doom and gloom and will say, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and we've got moral failures, we're going to be punished, the world's going to, civilization as we know it's going to end in a way. But what Douthat is saying is that it's just, the more likely scenario is just going to continue. We're just going to sort of limp on. I read someone else, or perhaps one of the Douthat interviews, saying it's a bit like being on the Titanic in slow motion, but not actually getting to the iceberg ever. It's sort of this inevitable sort of drift towards disaster, but not actually getting there. And for me, that's almost, a worse existence. And I think he talks about another poem where, in the book, about waiting, the Romans waiting for the barbarians to come, but they don't come. And the people are kind of just lost and confused, and there's a lack of meaning there. And I think that's the kind of thing he's describing. But it's both, in one sense, quite hopeless. But for me, it's also inspired some more thoughts of, well, how do we get out of this? What are some imaginative ways? What are some creative ways? What are some ways to bring warmth and hope into society?
In the book, Douthat poses a thought experiment from economist Robert Gordon. Given two choices, option A, you're allowed to keep all 2002 electronic technology and you can keep running water in indoor toilets, but you can't use anything invented since 2002. Option B is that you get everything invented in the past decade, but you have to give up running water in indoor toilets. Which option would either of you choose?
I hated this. I fundamentally reject this question. Like it's kind of, his moment where he convinces you, he thinks he's convinced us all that like nothing good has happened since 2002, like that we have just had total slowdown of advancement, invention, innovation, and that really like everything invented since 2002 is useless, or at least not really that great. Part of the argument I get, because, you know, I remember, I think it was the iPhone 5 when it came out in 2013, 14. I remember seeing that they had, Apple had their advertising campaign, and across the whole window of stores was just this, you know, monolithic photo of the iPhone 5, and it said, everything has changed. And it was just like, no, fundamentally it has not changed. First of all, not everything in the world has changed, but not even everything with the iPhone has changed.
There was an ad for a TV that I was watching on the television, funnily enough. It had the exact same thing last night. Everything has changed, and it's maybe slightly flatter. Not much has changed.
Yeah, and I think what he's reacting to isn't necessarily a lack of an innovation, but he's reacting to the marketing. I think the marketing has tried to become more grand and funnily enough, invite us into a narrative of excitement and change when really it's not that different. But also what he's saying about invention and innovation since 2002 is to reduce it basically to, hey, the iPad wasn't that great. And actually there's a huge amount of stuff that's happened since 2002, like 3G and 4G on our phones. The fact that I can go to any city around the world and I can put into Google, I can stand there with a connection to their 4G network, stand there and like basically go, hey, I want to get to this place that's like 40 minutes away across the city. I do not know anything about this city. And Google Maps will tell me, hey, you know, you can take this bus, then get onto this train and go. And I'm literally can rely on that and then go and do it. I traveled just before Google Maps started doing that, and then about a year after they started doing that. It was an unbelievable innovation. I've also had like one of those moments of just going at a piece of technology where like Google Translate has an app where you can just use your phone on your camera to look at a piece of, you know, it was a Spanish word, and literally the phone changes the word like live to translate it into English. And I was just like, this is unbelievable. Like that is so amazing. I mean, I'm not constantly in a dual language environment, but I was like, this is such a cool piece of technology. And the argument he's making is essentially that the only innovations and inventions that have been made are just kind of convenience advancing. But the problem is that he's using as his main thing a convenience innovation. Like running water in a house and toilets in a house doesn't actually do anything new. There were already outhouses. You could already poop on a seat. You just had to walk outside to do it. And so he's saying that the invention of running water is just so convenient that it changes the game. But I would argue that some of the innovations that have been made since 2002, they're just building on top of a foundation we already have. And to basically say, well, you know, I'll take out these sort of blocks of the foundation that you've taken for granted your entire life, just to give you the sort of, you know, stuff that we built on top of that foundation. Well, I don't know. I thought it was a false experiment, and I kind of resisted it because it seemed like he was saying, ha ha. And I was like, well, you scratch under the surface and really it's just swapping one convenience for the other. But it's a convenience that we have lived our entire lives with. So we think it's essential.
I mean, I think it comes down to orders of magnitude as well, because I think I'd have more sympathy to Douthat's argument here than what it sounds like you have at the moment, Jeremy, is that yes, a lot of these things are around convenience, but there's a distinct difference between the horse and cart. Say in the 40s you've got cars, in the 80s you've got airplanes, which we've gone from horse and cart, which is just sort of traveling around, to being able to travel 900 kilometers an hour from country to country. Like that seems like a significant step change versus this sort of incremental, just this is slightly more convenient than opening a map and going for a walk and asking someone.
Yes, and I agree with that. And part of my frustration is I think he chose the wrong example.
Yeah.
So if you were to say like you can no longer have the physics of the internal combustion engine, or like the sort of steam, like basically the stuff that gave rise to the Industrial Revolution. Like there are particular inventions inventions like the press that enabled people to actually read for the first time. Like these are huge society-wide inventions. And I note that he sort of, says 2002 because obviously the internet had fully become part of most people's lives by then. And so he's acknowledging that actually the internet, is this massive society. It's a norm shaping and a norm changing environment. We are no longer the same people that we were before we had the internet. Stuff like smartphones and putting those devices in our hands and having them with us all the time is sort of the same thing as taking the steam engine and putting it into an automobile so that families can now choose to travel what would have taken them a day or two to get there, and they can travel there in a couple of hours. Or, the parish church model was exploded by the idea of the automobile. The fact that you could now choose to worship in a place where you liked the preacher, you liked the priest, rather than just having to stay within walking distance of your home. Like these kinds of inventions, yes, they're convenience, but they also fundamentally shape how we behave as human beings and how we relate to one another. And I think that in terms of benefit and making us better people, almost definitely the smartphone hasn't done that. But you also look at things like social media, the fact that we now have cameras on us at all times. These things have enabled, the Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd, that video was taken on a camera phone. If the people standing there watching that just had to repeat to a news camera 3 hours later what they had seen, it would not have had the same impact as us all being able to actually see what happened to him. And so I think we can't avoid how these inventions shape us and how massive they are. Like the Arab Spring, for all that it hasn't actually ended up accomplishing, the fact that dictators were toppled because of Twitter and because of the information sharing that governments can no longer control. That's a massive deal, and that I would argue wasn't available in 2002. So anyway, this is just me saying I think it's dumb.
Again, the technologies are for good and evil. They are tools. What resonates a lot with me about what Douthat's saying is that the smartphone and sort of the post 2002 innovations have in large, and even more so today, once we start to think about virtual reality and a lot of the digital innovations are moving away from reality. So if you take the steam engine or planes, they are physically moving people from one place to another. You're engaging with reality, whereas a lot of the innovations today are almost abstracting us from reality, where we're not meeting face to face. We are communicating from a distance, and we lose a lot from that. He talks about this affecting, going back to sort of the fertility thing, that young people aren't going on dates anymore. They're having less sex. Things are changing, and it's moving towards that sort of sense of numbness again, rather than the reality. It's a disengagement. And he talks about that with drugs as well, as that the drugs, the opioids in the States, marijuana, these are numbing drugs. We're trying to escape from reality. That's part of the challenge of modern society, and a lot of technology has facilitated that as well. And so I think, yes, the innovations, but the more that we abstract from the reality and the joy and the suffering that we were talking about before, then we lose something.
Yeah, and I think also, to give a version of his argument its due, another thing he says within the book is talking about innovations that actually increase productivity and increase the opportunity for economic growth. So he talks about the fact that economic growth, particularly in America and Europe, has stagnated since about the 60s or 70s, and a lot of that is because essentially we had these kind of massive, he calls it America's already picked all the low-hanging fruit, and the low-hanging fruit was basically, let's move from an agrarian economy where people are kind of moving from subsistence farming to mechanized farming, but then also the sort of efficiency gains from machinery have been realized. And that was what drove, and also the world wars and kind of the massive amounts of energy that was around creating and the technological pushes that war necessitates and creates. Those have all been done, and the rising economies are the ones that are sort of going through that process themselves now. And so, yeah, the technological advances that we're having are advances in communication and entertainment, really, and they are not productive innovations. And so they're not. The only one that I would say is that basically FaceTime and Zoom, video conferencing allowed us to be productive, many of us to be productive during COVID. And so, I just imagine what COVID would have been like if we didn't have the internet and we didn't have, video calling that was as reliable as it was. It would have impacted our economy a lot more.
This book was written before COVID, and in an interview that I was listening to a few days ago, he was saying that the coronavirus is doing a stress test on what our decadent society looks like. Do you guys have any comments on that, or how do you think COVID-19 can take us out of decadence or reshape our society?
COVID was interesting in the sense that I think normally a sort of not just a national crisis, but a global crisis is something that can sort of shake us out of our comfortableness. And I think COVID did to an extent, but the unique thing with COVID is it wasn't necessarily a time where we could physically come together and band together in the way that we normally would, say, after a natural disaster such as an earthquake. It made some things, even some decadent aspects of society, worse in the sense that you can just actually check out of society entirely. You had an excuse to do so. I know I took a few opportunities for that. But at the same time, the unique thing with COVID was that almost others were the enemy, and it was difficult to unite together and come together.
I think there's two examples that are on display. I think that New Zealand has done a pretty good example of being non-decadent and of allowing COVID to actually be a creative force to, full credit to the cultural leadership of our Prime Minister during that time. I think with the right leadership, COVID actually gave us an opportunity to think about. I was going for walks around my neighborhood. I felt more connected to the fact that I was living in a community. I, saw the bears in the window, and these things are all small, but the fact that they were kind of our collective response, I guess because they happened in New Zealand, we can kind of just go, oh, well, of course, But when you look at what's happening in America and you look at the cultural impact of the response to COVID and the fact that it wasn't well led by America's leadership, that basically it was used, first of all, as kind of COVID's a conspiracy, it's not real. We don't have to take it seriously. And then, we might have to take it seriously. Okay, let's lock down, but we're not really that stoked about it, whatever. And then you basically have, it became politicized, whether you're wearing a mask is kind of, was a sign of whether or not you were a sort of a cuck who was willing to let the government bully you into doing or let the experts or the elite tell you what to do. I unfortunately have engaged in a number of kind of Facebook discussions with people who've basically been like, well, the evidence is in wearing a mask doesn't stop you from getting COVID. And it's like, yeah, but the evidence is in wearing a mask stops you from inadvertently passing COVID on. So actually a joint societal collective response, living within a narrative that it's all of our responsibility to care for each other. I think that was seen quite strongly in New Zealand amongst the majority of us, that we were like, okay, this is a big deal for some people. Some people will die if they get COVID. I probably won't, but I think it's worth. And there was a lot of memes flying around like, oh, this is the most wonderful thing, and this is the biggest collective act of love. And at the time I was like, oh my gosh, okay, get over it. It's just something we're doing. But the further away I get from it, I kind of see that. And especially when you see in America, the response of people being like, you can't make me wear a mask I don't have COVID and I'm not, that selfishness is actually, I think, a huge sign of decadence, because it's basically saying wearing a mask would be a little bit uncomfortable for me, and my life is about being comfortable and about dictating the terms of how I live, and living into a bigger narrative around what's good for humanity, what's good for all of us, and what's good for my neighbor, and being able to think outside of myself and having a vision for that. I think that's anti-decadent. The selfishness and the kind of my rights, you can't make me, that strikes me as being particularly decadent. And I think we're seeing the results of that playing out in America and in the massive increase and spike in their cases. And I guess the unapologetic nature of people going, oh, well, freedom. And it's a kind of freedom that doesn't actually produce good ends. There's different kinds of freedom out there. There's different kinds of freedom. And I think freedom that looks to a good outcome or a good end, freedom that has a good telos is worth fighting for. But freedom that is basically just an individualistic, libertarian freedom where you can't make me is inherently childish and stupid.
I agree. As Matthew Arnold said, freedom is a good horse to ride, but you need to ride it somewhere. And I think that's what you're getting at, Jeremy, is that it's a freedom for something, a freedom rather than just a freedom from others telling me what to do. But I mean, I think the New Zealand experience of COVID also showed that our constitution is one that is broadly anti-decadent in being able to respond quite quickly, especially when you compare it to the United States, who is sort of the definition of the institution that's full of deadlock and you can't actually do anything. I mean, I definitely take for granted that there are risks and we need the checks and balances on power. Douthat would probably say that the Chinese government was very non-decadent in their response to COVID as well. And that goes again back to that point of decadence, not always good, not always bad. But we showed that as a nation that we could be quite effective, institutionally fairly robust through that process. But I mean, some of the wheels are falling off a bit now.
So Douthat speaks into movies quite a bit. Jeremy, you mentioned the Brad Pitt movie. He uses the example of Star Wars, saying that the first 3 that they created, like chronologically in the 70s, 80s, were completely unique to the screen at the time. But then he says that any following sequel or trilogy had such high hopes of being globally successful, just turned out to be remakes and just repetition of what was already created as a unique movie. Do you think cinema and culture has changed over the last decade, or is Douthat's commentary on repetition correct?
I have a lot of sympathy for Douthat's argument here in this. I don't think it's his. I think he borrows off another author, but basically looking at the cultural differences. If you take art or film or dance from, say, the 40s and compare it to the 80s, there's a significant difference there. It's distinct. And even break that down between the 40s, from the 60s to the 80s, they're distinct periods. You could identify those sort of cultural artifacts by the time frame. But is there much of a difference between the 80s and the 2000s? Is there much of a difference between the 2000s and the 2020s culturally? And I'd say I'd agree that it has tapered off, and that there is a significant amount of repetition in our culture. There's not a sense of, yes, there are people doing innovative, creative things at the margins, but if we take the broader Western culture, I think it is broadly defined by repetition. And you see people like, I mean, he sort of name checks the Marvel films, and you see Martin Scorsese, who I think has done a lot of innovative stuff, like with The Irishman and with the film Silence as well recently. Got into a lot of trouble calling the Marvel films, critiquing that they weren't cinema, that they weren't art, basically because they were
theme parks.
They were theme parks. They're bread and circuses, that they're not doing anything new. They're just following a formula. And one of the worst parts is that a lot of these are based on algorithms and just giving people what we want. And it raises questions: is this what we want? Do we just want the same thing? Do we just want nostalgia? And it's quite concerning.
Like, I feel throughout this chapter he was just continuously hating on our culture, and especially with that example of the 20-year slots of what fashion looks like, what architecture looks like, what movies look like. It's all very distinctive if you go back. But the last 20 years, he keeps saying that it's just so decadent and everything has been the same, of like stagnation and repetition. But surely some good has come out of the last 20 years.
He argues that you can have a non-decadent society that is characterized by bad films or bad, they're sort of the normative thing. But the thing that he is critical about and what defines decadence is the repetition. It's the nothing new. Like right at the start of the podcast, we were talking about, well, it's a lack of freshness, a lack of creativity, imagination, a lack of dealing with or exploring some of the deeper themes of what it means to be human that's kind of missing here.
One of the deep ironies of the fact that he's describing, and I think quite accurately describing, the repetition of culture and art in our society. And what he's referring to is essentially popular culture, like popular movies and popular books and popular art, because essentially those are the ones that get most people's attention. The idea that we're just churning remakes and doing sequels and returning to the same properties over and over again, I find it reflective of the fact that we have stopped assuming a cultural canon. So post-war, there was this real pushback, and I think it probably was going on pre-war as well, but there was this idea that Western civilization and Western culture had a canon of the greats, that you basically needed to do service to the greats. You needed to read them all, you needed to know them before you were kind of able to start creating your own work. So you had things like the Odyssey, the Iliad, you had the great works of English literature, you had the great, there were some American greats in there as well. They were necessarily confined. There was Shakespeare, there was the great poets that you would study, and they were recognized like these are superlative works of art. And that basically if you were going to go and make art, you needed to sort of know these and understand their form and their substance before you were kind of worth your salt, before you could be trusted to make great art. And what happens there is that you play into the archetypes that are within our culture, the great stories that kind of shape our imaginations as we're growing up, and as we grow up with the fairy tales that we grow up with. I'm now looking to, what fairy tales am I going to tell my daughter as I begin reading stories to her, and I reach for the ones that I loved when I was a kid. And so this is how culture passes on. The issue is that basically we got to a point with culture where we wanted to do away with it all. Like the sort of 50s, there was a movement within academia, and then more broadly within the 60s, 70s of going, what, we don't need to be bound to these old dead white men. We don't need to be bound to these sort of dead relics of a culture that failed us by delivering us 2 world wars. We need to have the freedom, because creativity is all around us, and each one of us has a story, and each one of us has an authentic voice, and we need to be unafraid of giving rise and giving voice to that authentic self. Stop me if you have heard this in every Disney movie for the last 20-30 years. And so this narrative is now, basically everyone is going, well, I can tell a unique story, or I can make a unique song, and there are greats that are coming out of that. But what's interesting is that the great songwriters that were in the 60s and 70s, they were still the ones who were formed in their education by the sort of classical education. And now it seems like we're feeding off of the creativity of the sort of generation that were making films and art in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and a little bit of the 90s, and we're basically then just churning that over. And I really wonder if it's because we don't have cultural archetypes anymore. So the cultural archetypes that we have are the movies and the books that we read when we were kids. And so there's no collective language that is of this kind of substance that warrants further, going over. So you can go over a piece of Shakespeare, you can remake a Shakespeare into Clueless, or you can remake a Shakespeare play into 10 Things I Hate About You, and it is an identifiable piece of cinema that stands on its own as a great, fun story. Even though the bones of it are taken from a Shakespeare play, it finds new form because it's a good enough story. But it's not a remake, it's not a sequel necessarily. And so I do wonder if there's a quality question around the archetypes we now have. And the reason we don't like it is because essentially that Back to the Future isn't a deep enough story to warrant rehashing again and again and again. There's not deep enough truths in that art to actually feed us when the next generation tries to mine that content. And so it becomes nostalgia rather than art.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Does that have something to do with nostalgia and looking back at the good old days with rose-tinted glasses, but actually the context of where they got their greatness from? We no longer trust that history of the Odyssey or those classic things, but we no longer are looking towards anything new. So we're just stuck living in this present moment of repetition.
Well, and the irony of it is that we think that so much of the narrative around how we create art is about newness. It's like we need new, authentic voices. We don't just want to rely on the old, but there's something, authenticity isn't a guarantee of quality. Authenticity is not a guarantee of beauty. And so in art, in culture that we look to, that and again, what we're talking about is popular culture. We're talking about culture that speaks to the mass, because we need shared experiences. We need shared cultural touchstones in order to have the kind of societal narrative that will actually help us to band together, that will help us to, actually understand one another, whether or not we share the same kind of identity markers, that we actually have these shared stories that mean that we understand each other. And so I just make a play for the fact that beauty is real. It's a real thing that we actually recognize whether or not we want to, and that just because a voice is new and just because a voice is authentic to the person themselves doesn't mean that they are worth listening to.
No, but I totally agree with that. Like, I was, like, in my reflections on this chapter, it feels like we're culturally lost. For fashion, for example, if you spend any time in Wellington, people are looking for being authentic and being different, but then you look at their fashion and the way that they live and it feels like very 70s and 80s. But then in other pockets of New Zealand, I don't know, people just all look the same. So it's like, are we just stuck in this loop of either trying to recreate a history that we don't fully understand, or like understand how they were formed in the 70s or 80s? Are we just stuck or lost, or I don't know?
I mean, I think lost is probably a good description. I think it's if we throw away all of tradition and all of the good things that have been passed on that we can inherit, and we're told that we can find ourselves and create everything anew and be authentic, we are still unmoored. And I think this is perhaps going back to some of the earlier themes. A lot of young people today are lost as well, like in their lives, in vocations, in career. What am I supposed to do? I've been told I can do everything. But just like the sort of the end of the space race and sort of coming back to Earth with a thud and saying, oh, it wasn't all that it cracked up to be, or I couldn't be this. There's this real sort of realization of reality that I think is pushing a lot of the movements towards numbing, whether it's numbing drugs or numbing distractions, because the reality can be really hard. But we haven't been, I would argue that people and young people today haven't been given the tools, or haven't been given the opportunities to be shaped and be prepared and respond to reality as it is, and the highs and lows and the struggles, as we said before. And I just want to, again, coming back to the broader cultural question, one of the reasons why we do get these remakes and sequels is because they're not risky. And back in the day, cinema and art there was a risk. You took a risk on a particular director, on a particular story, and it was either going to be great or potentially a failure. But now everything is focus grouped and tested, and there are algorithms, and the movies that are made are safe and they're comfortable. And it comes back to this idea of decadence. It's just comfortable. There's no risk, there's no suffering, but there's no greatness as well. And that's I think what Douthat's trying to get here, is that perhaps it's misguided in the sort of space realm as far as what we're looking for. But we're looking for something more, and there's perhaps those words, something more than there's something more than this. There's a restlessness that I think he's putting his finger on, that I think it's really important that we try to grasp and grapple with.
And I do just want to say, to temper what I said before, like there is genius out there. There is great art being made. And it's probably being made in the same sorts of amounts that, great art was being made in previous generations. Like, we probably have the same number of geniuses as previous generations had. It's just that now, with the, huge availability of, everyone has a camera, so everyone's a photographer. And so actually sifting in the idea, and also I think that plays into this idea that, everyone's authentic voices, and everyone is a talent, everyone has the same equal opportunity to be, to have their voice, and we have these sorts of senses that there needs to be an equity to availability to all these things. And I don't really know how you bring a curatorial voice that does still provide equity, because at some point someone's got to decide, well, this is art and this is not, or this is worthy of a larger group of people looking at. But that's one of the biggest things that we are short of now, is that we are short of essentially trusted curatorial voices, because we're so time poor. You can't listen to everyone's EP. And so I think
the algorithms come in, though.
Yeah, well, and that's the problem, is that algorithms now create, there's a Spotify sound, there's a sound that people know is comforting. It's one of those things where music that people are willing to just have on in the background while they do their everyday, that's the music that makes money on Spotify, because you get
chill.
Well, yeah, you get your streams up because and so people are not necessarily going to make challenging or confronting music because that's not something you just put on in the background. But I know that there are movies that have brought me to tears that I've seen in the last 2 years. They're not necessarily blockbuster movies, but they're still being made, and there is still art that's being made that is beautiful. There's still architecture that is not just riffing off of and replicating beautiful old Romanesque or Palladian architecture. There is new architecture being made that is truly beautiful. It's just that there's so much of it out there that's sifting through it to find it. There's still genius, and so I wouldn't be so, I'm not depressed. I'm not sort of, despairing at the fact that there's nothing good out there. I just think that our culture needs to reclaim the ability to call things beautiful or to call things good, and to say, actually, that's not. Ultimately, genius is recognized kind of more after its time anyway, because it will survive.
And you can see why Douthat sort of obscures the question of good art and bad art and just talks about repetition, because it's a difficult ground to...
Yeah.
So to wrap up this conversation, what has this book left you with? What did you learn? Did you even enjoy it?
Yes, Kieran, as the person who chose this book for the book club,
yes.
Did you even enjoy it?
Guilty as charged. I did enjoy it, and I think it has left me with, I think, as I said before, a sense of despair, but also a bit of an inspiration to work out and think about and chat with others around how can we get the warmth, the creativity, and the hope that Auden talks about, do the best we can to restore or redeem some of the more decadent aspects of our society. I enjoyed it. I think there were certainly aspects and some of the scenarios that he speaks about that were less persuasive. And he's very good at sort of making a prognosis of the problem, but less adept at painting future scenarios of what that could look like. But I think that's fair. It's a very difficult thing to predict the future, which is what he's trying to do. But I think some of his prognosis, particularly around the sort of this notion of us as a society broadly in the West being comfortably numb, really challenging. And thinking about how, for me and for our society, how to engage more deeply and richly and in a more human way to move beyond distractions, to move beyond abstractions and disconnections. And I think, as we said before, Jeremy has said, it's surprising he hasn't spoken about actually just we need to build warmer relationships and more vulnerable relationships and that sort of social aspect of life. I think it's a real challenge to go there.
As I said at the beginning of the podcast, I feel like Douthat's frustration is that, he talks about decadence not necessarily being, or the reverse of decadence not necessarily being good or bad in and of itself. It's more kind of a state. But I do think that decadence for a society can be comfortable and can mean a lack of violence or, and those things are good. I think that on a society level, decadence can be fine. I think that Douthat's real frustration, and the reason why we sort of get a sense of despair from him, is that he knows that decadence is not good for the soul. That decadence is a state for a person to be in. As a state for a person to be in, decadence is destructive, and ultimately it carves away or it gnaws away at what is good about humanity. And so I think that personal decadence, and that's what the main thing I'm taking away from this is, that actually it's an encouragement to go, well, I might not be able to fix society, I might not know where the world is going and how this can be solved on a societal level. But fundamentally, it is a conviction, and it is a moment of going, how am I making sure that I am not overwhelmed by cynicism, that I am still, like you say, remaining hopeful, that I am tending to, and our last book was The Road to Character, that I'm tending to my character, because I think that someone who is actually seeking to grow their character and become a person of character is not decadent, because that growth that is required is painful to achieve. Like actually being, like we said, being vulnerable and being able to talk about our weaknesses openly and actually say, I need to improve, that's the opposite of decadence. And so I think that it's interesting, the through line from Road to Character into the Decadent Society. I almost wonder if we had done the books the other way around, that the Road to Character would have almost been a conversation about how we personally move away from decadence ourselves. And I think that it's a really cool moment to realize that these books are in conversation with each other for me. And I think that, reading this, I was kind of like, oh gosh, these big societal problems are kind of unknowable, how they came about necessarily, because it's all a big blend of a whole bunch of different impetuses. Fundamentally for me, going away from this, I'm like, how can I be someone who is constantly growing? How can I be, and not growing in the sort of Adam 1 kind of perspective, but growing in that sense of going, how can I be someone who is full of joy, who doesn't avoid suffering just for the sake of avoiding suffering, but actually, how do I lean into those human moments, and how do I make myself ready if my life is to lead to a point where I'm called to lead or called to speak into something that's bigger than just me and my family. How can I be ready to take on that responsibility in the hopes that I might be able to have a positive impact? And I think that is the surest way to walk away from kind of a sense of despair, like, what can I really change? Because I think that's the danger of reading a book like this, is going like, oh gosh, like, I can't really do anything. And it's just like, well, yes, you can. You can actually be the kind of person who speaks against whatever this decadence actually is.
Wow. That was a great reflection. No, I actually loved that. Because I would be the person that would be like, man, this is just so big. It's like this wall that you're just confronted with and there's no hooks to climb into. But that's like, that's so beautiful. And I hadn't seen that connection between that and the way that we form ourselves, but also are like formed and shaped by our community and those around us. But it's a shame that Ross didn't really go there. To all of you listening along, thank you so much for joining us for this month's Book Club podcast. If you want to read along with us and have the opportunity to submit questions to add to the podcast discussion, be sure to email bookclub@maxim.org.nz and we'll sign you up. There you'll get notifications about the next book we'll be diving into, including next month, where we'll write up a reading guide to prompt questions and further thinking into the books that we're reading together. From all of us here at Maxim, we thank you for participating and we look forward to hearing from you soon. Mā te wā.